Thank you, Jim, and good evening to everybody. And good evening also to those who are going to be watching online later on. It's a great treat to be able to share these lectures with such a wide audience. Thank you. The Merchant Adventurers have a very strong relationship with the University of York. Some earlier of our members actually helped found the university in the very beginning, and we feel very proud of our constant relationship with the university. We regularly have both arts and science lectures here, and in June we will have our first business development lecture as well, which is an excitement to look forward to. We regularly have business breakfasts that we run with the University of York Enterprise Works. And of course, within our charitable environment, we work a lot with younger children, with Year 7 children, working in partnership with the ISSP, which is a state school partnership which is designed to encourage younger people to think about their business development in the longer term. And we also support the young people within the armed services who are put forward by their team as having done particularly well in the year. So great that you could join us this evening. Thank you. I'm going to introduce in a moment Professor Andy Dougal, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Sciences at the University of York, and he, in turn, will introduce Nicola. At the end of Nicola's lecture, there's an opportunity for questions, so please do think about that as we go along. And for now, thank you. Andy.
Thank you, Delma. So as Delma says, I'm Andy Dougal. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Sciences at the University here in York. And it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Nicola Carslaw. This lecture series has proved enormously popular, as it is again today, over 27 occasions, I'm told. Organised jointly by the university and the Merchant Adventurers. These lectures are designed specifically to provide a platform to inform the people of York of important discoveries in pure and applied sciences made by the academics at the university and how they can influence our lives here in the city. So this lecture is part of the York Ideas programme that the university runs throughout the year, designed to educate, entertain and inspire, I'm told. So there's your challenge, Nicola, for tonight. Really designed to showcase York as a city of ideas and innovation and how that commitment plays into a diverse set of audiences and really targeting how science, in this case, can be used for the public good. So on which note, it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Nicola Carslaw is a professor of indoor chemistry in our Department of Environment and Geography at the university, which I'm also a member, and therefore can really advocate that it is one of the leading centres nationally and internationally on a whole range of environmental issues. You'll have seen today the news around the latest climate change report, impacts on food security, water quality, biodiversity loss, a whole range of pressing global issues that the department researches on. Nicola's research exemplifies the excellence and relevance of that department. She's worked in the field of air pollution for the last 30 years, with her research initially focused on outdoor air quality, but for the last 15 years or so on indoor air quality, so really before it became a fashionable, important thing that we all knew about. Nicola currently leads grants worth over £4 million from the UK Research Councils. The Impeccable project has involved studying the impacts of cooking and cleaning on indoor air quality, whilst the Ingenious project is studying the air quality in homes across Bradford. As well as those UK projects, she also leads networks with approximately 200 scientists in a European grant, which will shape air quality research in Europe over the coming years, and has collaborations as a key member of US-led Alfred Sloan chemistry of indoor environmental programs. Finally, she is a member of the UK Government's Department of Health's Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution and a member of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, as well as the Royal College of Physicians Working Group for Indoor Air Quality. So that's quite a range of badges that she's got, which really show the excellence that she'll put across, hopefully, in the next 40 minutes or so. So over to you, Nicola.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you for making the effort to come out this evening and listen to this presentation. And I'm going to be talking all about indoor air pollution, which is a very, in my opinion, understudied topic. And the rather provocative title there about the dirty secret that might be lurking in all of your homes. So, just to put it into context and to think about why I think it's really important to study indoor air pollution, I've got some numbers up here, and these are all in years. So can anyone think, and we're thinking about human life scales here, what 79 years might represent? Yes, average age, thank you. So this is the average lifespan. It's actually for a US male, but it's pretty similar for females and also other developed countries, pretty much the same sort of figure. So 79 years, the average lifespan. Now, out of that 79 years, where do you think you will spend 70 of those years on average? Indoors, yes, you're getting this quickly, that's good. So this is why it's really important that we think about air quality indoors, because we spend the vast majority of our time there, at least in developed countries. 85 to 90% is the figure that you often see quoted. So then we can go down a bit into a slightly finer scale. So where do you think you might spend 50 years? And this is a particular environment. So in our own homes. I'm ignoring the people that say in bed. That might apply to teenagers, perhaps, but not to the rest of us who have to work. So if we go down to 26 years, where do you think you spend 26 years of your time? So that's actually how much time you spend in the bedroom. So a very important room in your home, because you spend about a third of your time there. We have to go all the way down to that 5 years before we have the average number of years in that 79 that you spend outdoors. And despite that, all of the regulation around air quality, most of the funding from the funding bodies, the science councils and governments, goes on outdoor air quality and all the regulation as well. So this is why I think we need to readjust the way we think. We need to think far more about our total exposure to air pollution, whether that happens indoors or outdoors, to get the whole story. So just to explain that, 4 years at the end is the average time we spend commuting, which is very depressing. So why study indoor air pollution now? So that's a kind of general context, but I think now it's more important than ever that we think about what's going on in our buildings. So if you think about how behaviour has changed over the last 50 or 60 years, we've moved very much towards spending more and more time indoors. So whilst 50 or 60 years ago, a lot of jobs that people did might have been spent at least part of the time outdoors, now a lot of us spend most of the day in an office building. And there's kind of an illustration here. It's a bit stereotyped maybe, but you know, children used to be set out of the house in the morning and told to go out and play and come back at tea time. And now, you know, you have far more time spent indoors, gaming, texting. Like I say, it's a bit generalizing, but you get the general picture. So we've definitely shifted our behavior in terms of our jobs and our leisure time. And over that same sort of period, we're actually spending a lot more time thinking about energy efficiency. So we care far more about that now, not just because it's expensive, but because we care about the climate, like we heard in the introduction. So if we want to make our homes more energy efficient, one thing we can do is make them more airtight. So things like double glazing, insulation. And what all of that does is it means that we have a lot less fresh air coming in. So if you look at this graph here, it's showing over the last 100 years, and this is the age of the house, sorry. So as you go along here, the houses get older, were built longer ago. And what this is showing on this axis here is just a kind of proxy for leakage rate of a house. So you can see that 100 years ago, buildings were a lot leakier than they are now. The other thing that's changed a lot over that time scale is how much stuff we buy. So we've become a very much more consumer-driven society. We like to buy lots of new things, none of this making do and fixing things like my nan used to do, for instance, so we just buy new stuff all the time. And that's important because new stuff often contains much higher emissions of some of the chemicals I'm going to be talking about later. So you know that smell you have, a new bit of furniture, new carpet, that shows you that some of the chemicals that are forming these products are off-gassed much more quickly when things are new. So if you put all of that lot together, we're spending more time indoors in much more airtight buildings than we used to, and we're bringing more new stuff into those buildings all the time. So you can see that we're being exposed to more and more things when we're in our homes than we used to be. And then finally, the recent thing that's happened is the pandemic, obviously, and that's also driven a lot of behaviour change. So it's made us think a lot more about ventilation and air quality now, so we tend to think a lot more about the quality of our air in buildings than we used to, which is good. But it's also going to drive other behaviour shifts, like people are likely to work from home more often. So it's even more important that we understand what's going on in the air in our homes. So we can think about the sources of pollution in a typical house, and some of those are obvious, so we probably already know about things like cooking and cleaning, but there are other more subtle sources as well. So I've already mentioned things like furnishings. Our pets can bring in bits and pieces from outdoors, but also their fur can be a problem for some people that are asthmatic, for instance. You can see some stoves there, wood stove, candles. If you've got an integral garage, some of these fumes from the cars can end up ingressing into the house as well. So there's a whole range of stuff going on, and that's before you even start to think about things like showering, when potentially there's mold and damp if the house isn't well ventilated. And then all of these emissions can exchange with outdoors as well. So if you're on a busy road, we can have stuff coming in from outdoors as well. So it all gets really complicated, and no two buildings are alike either. So when we put all of that together, what it means is that for some air pollutants, the concentrations that we are exposed to are actually much higher indoors and outdoors. So things like volatile organic compounds, which we think a lot about at York, both in environment and geography, also in chemistry, there's a lot of research going on into these compounds. And it's likely that the concentrations of these are much, much higher indoors. So there's a quote here from the World Health Organization, which kind of puts all this work in context. And this is the same if you're looking at indoor or outdoor air quality. And the World Health Organization said, I think this was a couple of years ago, air pollution is one of the greatest environmental risks to health. By reducing air pollution levels, countries can reduce the burden of disease from stroke, heart disease, lung cancer, chronic and acute respiratory diseases, including asthma. So there's a whole lot of reasons why we need to understand where our exposure to air pollution is happening. Okay, so let's look at some of these sources of indoor pollution in a bit more detail. So I'm going to show you some results from research we're doing at York, but also more wider afield as well. And there's some basic stuff that we already know about cooking. So we know, for instance, that if you cook with gas, so if you've got a gas hob, you generally tend to have higher emissions of pollutants than if you have an electric hob, and that is purely because of that flame. So basically, if you use a flame to cook, then you have a source of combustion products. So just like you would outdoors with a bonfire or combustion engine in a car, you're going to make the same sort of air pollutants, so nitrogen oxides, particulate matter. We know that cooking meat, so if you're frying meat, you have much higher emissions of air pollutants than if you're frying vegetables. So if you're vegetarian like me, you can be really smug. Frying gives far more emissions than things like boiling, baking, and steaming as well. And we also know that different oils, if you fry with different oils, you can have different emissions from those. And that's because of the flash point of the oil. So depending on that, you can get higher or lower emissions. There's some other quite interesting stuff as well. So this plot here is from an American study. And what they did in this study was they looked at cooking some different types of meals. So on the left here, we've got breakfast, and then just a bit of toast, a stir fry, I think this was a chicken stir fry, a chili and a lasagna. So these 5 different meals. And then they cooked these all in a very controlled way. and then they looked at the particulate matter emission. So particles, these are very small particles that can get down into your lungs. So we're very interested in these for health reasons. So they measured the particles that were formed when they made these different types of food. So the higher up the bar is here, the more particles were produced when you made that meal. And the different colours tell you something about the size of the particles. So as we go down this way in the bars, the particles are getting smaller and smaller. And we have more concerns from a health point of view with the really small particles, and the reason for that is they can get much further into your respiratory system. So the big ones tend to get filtered out by your nose and throat, but the smaller ones can get further down into your blood. So you can see that this meal, the breakfast and the stir fry, had really high emissions of particles when they were being made. And these both involve frying meat. So strangely, even though this was an American study, they did a full English for their breakfast. So we've got these two very high bars. The chili is maybe about halfway up, and then lasagna and toast are much lower. And what they found was that for the meals where they were predominantly frying meat, this is when you tend to get those higher emissions. For things like chili and lasagna, you tend to add a tin of tomatoes partway through the cooking. That kind of damped the production of the particles, if you like. So you get quite a big variation. Now, some of these numbers are quite high. You might not be able to see at the back, but some of these go up to about 300 in these units of micrograms per metre cubed. Now, for context, these are data from the City of Westminster, so outdoors, and we're looking at PM2.5, so that's a sort of midway up this scale particle, so it's everything below this bar between the pink and the purple. So you can see still about 275 micrograms per metre cubed here, over 300 here. Now on a busy street in London in the middle of the day, you're looking at more like 13. So obviously the particles have a different composition. Diesel particles outside, and these are produced from frying meat, so the composition is different, but it does show you that the concentrations are much, much higher for those short periods where you're cooking. So I thought it might be quite good to have a spices interlude, because this building used to be subject to lots of trading of spices. So you can see from that picture that comes from this building that the merchants used to bring spices up the river to trade them in this room, and things like frankincense and myrrh and cinnamon and mace. So we didn't have access to all of those things at York, but what we did look at was these spices here. So we had a range of dried spices. And as part of our impeccable study, which Andy mentioned at the start, where we're looking at cooking and cleaning emissions, we just tried heating some of these spices up in oil and looking at the emissions from them. So this plot looks a bit complicated, but there's just some simple things to take from it. So on the left-hand side, we've just got, this is when we just warmed up the oil without any spices in. So this is like the control, if you like. And then this kind of heat map to the right of there is showing what happens when you put different spices in the oil. And the darker the colour, the higher the emissions. So it's showing you that when you put pepper in oil, you get quite high emissions of quite a lot of these compounds. Now, these compounds are all fragrance compounds, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. So spices give off emissions when you cook, and that probably doesn't surprise you, because you know from that smell that something must be happening. Now, this is the point where I'm going to make you all feel really hungry and wish you could get home for your tea, but this is a chicken stir fry. So this is another recipe that we've been repeating as part of the impeccable study. So we have a very controlled way of doing it. We have a script, and we follow a time where we heat the oil, and then we add the spice, and then we add the meat. So it's all very repeatable. And what we're looking at here is different times of the meal. So first of all, at the top, what you can see is that when we start preparing the spices, we get emissions of the fragrance compounds again. So they're called terpenes, and we'll come back to these in a minute. So you start chopping up the spices, and you start to get emissions of those fragrance compounds. And then when we start heating up the oil, you can see that we get different compounds that start to go up. These are longer chained carbon species. And then when we throw the pack of sauce in at the end, this is a stir-fry sauce, sweet and sour chili sauce, you can see that you get a big peak of ethanol. So depending on what ingredients you're putting in, you can see that you get these different chemicals being released. So what are these fragrance chemicals that I keep referring to? Well, these are all natural products, but they're also made synthetically. So one of the most predominant in products that we use indoors is called limonene, and this is what gives you that citrusy smell. So if you've got a cleaning product or a fragrance that smells of citrus fruit, it will have limonene in it. And linalool is the smell that you get from lavender, and then pinene comes from pine trees, so that one's a bit easier to remember. So these are all natural compounds. Now, there is some chemical structures up there. They're quite complicated looking chemicals with rings and things and lots of bonds going in funny directions, but they are very, very reactive. So this is the only chemistry and the whole presentation, so please don't run away. But all I just want you to take from this is that we have these compounds. They are very complicated, and they can react with things indoors to produce things like formaldehyde and particles, so this particulate matter I've been referring to again, and we know that they are bad for your health. So what we focus on a lot at York is looking at the pathway. So one thing that we've been really interested in is the explosion of these so-called natural cleaning compounds. And I had a look on the internet a couple of days ago when I was getting this talk ready. And if you search for chemical-free cleaning products, you get tons and tons of different products that apparently are chemical-free. Now, obviously that's a nonsense. Water's a chemical, for instance. So none of these things are chemical-free. Now, when you start to read through the details behind some of these products, it's clear that what some of them mean is that it's free of toxic chemicals or free of harmful chemicals, but you have to get quite a long way down the page sometimes to understand that. So what we've done is looked at some of these products that are labelled as being natural or green to see how much different they are to the more traditional products that we can buy. And this is some work done by Ellen Harding-Smith in my group, and what she's done is looked at some regular cleaners versus some green cleaners. And what this is showing you, first of all, is just looking at a compositional, what's in these different things to start with. So it's just a count of the number of different chemicals in the green cleaners versus the traditional ones. And you can see that actually there's not that much difference, really. So there's more esters in regular cleaners that we don't tend to get in the green cleaners, but there's probably slightly more of the fragrance chemicals in some of these green cleaners, at least the ones we looked at. So really, they don't look that much different. And in fact, when you look at in a bit more detail at what's in some of these cleaning products, quite often the concentrations of some of these fragrance chemicals are actually higher in the green products compared to the natural ones. So don't worry too much about what all these numbers mean, but if the second letter on this scale is a G, it means it's a green product. If it's an R, it's a regular product. So you can see that the top four, and this time we've got a kind of intensity bar, so the ones with the higher bars means that there's more of that product. It means that there's more chemicals in that product. You can see that the four with the most chemicals in them are all green cleaners. So, sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. So basically, it's not really about whether a cleaning product is green or non-green. The important thing is what's in it and what the VOCs are, the volatile organic compounds. So we'll come back to that at the end. So scented candles. This market in scented candles keeps growing and growing by 4 to 5% a year. So there's some figures here of how, in US dollars, how it's predicted to increase. And if you go into one of these shops, which obviously I never do, you can see that you get this massive variety of different types of candles, every fragrance you could ever want in every different combination. And just as an interesting aside, it was noticed during the first COVID outbreak, people started complaining about scented candles and said, oh, I can't smell my candles anymore. And people have, or some scientists have actually looked at this now and shown that this is probably linked to the fact that people were losing their sense of smell during COVID. And so they thought there was something wrong with the candle, but it was actually an indicator that they probably had COVID. So there's been quite a lot of research starting to look at some of these candles now, and just looking at what comes out when you burn them. And this is showing some data from Now, this is just a small chamber looking at what happens when you light a candle. So it's only a meter cube, so just a small box. And what you can see, first of all, is that some of these fragrance chemicals are actually being emitted from the candle even before you light it, which makes sense because, you know, when you unwrap one of these things, you do get the smell. So it's already emitting some of the fragrances. But when you light it, and that's shown by this peak here, you can see that some of the concentrations get rather large. And again, nitrogen oxide concentrations much higher than you would have outdoors. So obviously, nobody sits in a meter cube box with a candle. This is a scientific experiment. But you can see that if you were in a small space, and maybe you had 2 or 3 of these, you'd have to be really careful to make sure that you ventilate that space appropriately. And then in Denmark, they're really obsessed with burning candles. So apparently in Denmark, they buy more candles per head of population than anywhere else on the planet. So they really, really like their candles. So there was a study where they went into 56 homes, and they looked at the exposure that all of these people in these houses had to particulate matter, these little particles. And then they tried to understand what the sources of those particles were in the home. So that's what these coloured bars are showing. And the purple on these coloured bars is the contribution from candles in each of those homes. And you can see that in nearly every single house, it's the candles that are forming the biggest source of exposure to these particles. Okay, so that's kind of, I don't know, active pollution sources, if you like, cooking, cleaning, lighting candles. But also just sitting around, we can impact the indoor air quality in a room. So we're all sitting here now breathing, well, hopefully anyway. But also our skin, we have lots of chemicals in our skin that will react with oxidants in the air. So if you could kind of focus in or around a body, you'd see a bit of a thermal plume, because we're all giving off heat, and you'd also see different chemicals when you are closer to your body than when you're further away from it. So we all know that we breathe out carbon dioxide, we breathe in oxygen, but we also breathe out a lot of other compounds. So on these plots over here, this is looking in detail at what people are breathing out, and every one of these blobs is a different compound that we breathe out. So breath is actually really complicated. Right, so as a brief aside, just to wake everyone up, so this is a room that we're in now, so you can see that they've actually removed those scales at the front. So they were here last time I was here. So apparently this room is 1,830 meters cubed. So how long do you think, assuming that we could seal up all the cracks in the building, how long do you think it would take for the oxygen to run out? And we're going to have to assume there are 100 people here, because that's what I did for the calculation. There are a few more, but if there's 100 people, any guesses? What do we think?
About 10 days.
That's a pretty good guess, actually. Any advance on 10 days? Higher, lower? Less. It would actually take about 6.5 days. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk for that long. You'll get out before that. So about 6.5 days for all of the oxygen to run out. Now, actually, it doesn't matter, because you'd actually be in trouble before that. Does anyone know why? What might happen before you run out of oxygen? CO2. Yes, that's right. So it would actually take about 1.5 days for the carbon dioxide to build up to what we'd call a toxic level, which is about 4,000 parts per million. So it's actually the CO2 that gets you first. So when you see all these movies where people are sort of gasping for breath, it wouldn't be like that. You wouldn't run out of oxygen first. You'd probably just fall asleep from the CO2. So anyway, on that brief aside, let's continue. And we're going to go back to some cinema experiments now. And these are really cool experiments. And when we look at things like breath emissions, it really varies a lot depending on how old you are, your gender, what you've eaten for tea, whether or not you smoke. So it's quite hard to make generalization about what people are breathing out. So this group of German scientists came up with a really cool idea, which was to go along to a cinema, where obviously you have 200 or 300 people might go along and watch a movie. And what they decided to do was to sample the air that was leaving the cinema. So you can see that this gentleman here is attaching some sort of sample line, and what they're doing is they're sampling the air as it comes out of that cinema. And what they found was something really interesting. So what we have on the right-hand side here is some concentrations of different breath chemicals. So on the left-hand side, we've got carbon dioxide, and that's shown in black. And then on the right-hand scale, acetone and isoprene are also in your breath when you breathe out. And what they found was that for 4 different showings of the same film, so it's the Hunger Games, if anyone's interested in the film, what they found was that all these little peaks and troughs in the breath emissions were at exactly the same point, exactly the same. So they could overlay them. This is 4 different viewings, 4 different lots of people, 4 different days. And what they found was that these little peaks and troughs were where people in the cinema were responding to things going on the screen. So these 2 red lines are showing a bit where the protagonist, Katniss, was being chased, was in some mortal danger, and literally the whole audience holds their breath. And then when the danger is past, breathe out again. And you can see that at the same time in all these showings of the movie. So a really neat experiment. What they were also able to show was that if they had the audiences watching a romantic film or a comedy or a suspense film, you could actually see different ratios, different compounds were being given out from the breath. And that showed that basically your body was producing different chemicals depending on if you were scared or feeling a bit slushy. So really, really interesting research. So behaviour is a really key thing. So we're learning this more and more. I think perhaps as physical scientists sometimes, we tend to like to go out and measure things and then decide that's what's happening. But sometimes we have to put the human back into that and think about the behaviour as well. So these are measurements from 6 houses in York. And the first 6 bars in all of these houses are 6 chemicals, volatile organic compounds, again, that you'd expect to find from vehicle emissions. So these 6 houses, sorry, I should have said, they're all on the same road. They're all identical buildings. So the outside is the same. The only thing that's different is what's going on indoors. So you can see that more or less between each of these houses, those first 6 bars are all pretty similar. But the last 2 bars are these fragrance chemicals that are coming from cleaning and doing other stuff indoors with different fragrances. And you can see that they vary enormously between houses. And in fact, in house 4, the concentrations were enormous in this house. And that was driven largely by the fact that the owners of this house had a dog. And every time the dog came in from outdoors, they would follow it around with a squirty spray, sort of air freshener, cleaning up after it. And they also like to use lots of scented candles. And this just goes to show that you really have to understand behaviour as well. So here's another example. This time we're now looking at a continual trace with time rather than averages like I showed you in the last plot, and we're looking at a family's house. So you can see that the family gets up in the morning, and then one of the first things you do, of course, is put the coffee machine on, and that pyridine peak is coming from the coffee. So that's the first thing that happens. And then there's various activities going on in the day. They're preparing for a big house party. So there's some cleaning going on, and you see some peaks in some of the cleaning products like acetone and ethanol. And then this big peak here is when they started to prepare a ratatouille. They're using some spices. So we can see something else happening here. And then you can probably all guess that when the guests arrived, you can probably all guess why the ethanol peak increases. So it's obviously a very sociable party. And then as the guests leave at the end, the dishwasher goes on and you get some different peaks associated with the dishwasher. So it's almost like a fingerprint of the activities going on in this house over the day by looking at the chemicals. Okay, so just the last few slides now. I just want to tell you a bit about some big projects going on at York at the moment. So I've told you a bit about our Impeccable study, which is all about cooking and cleaning. The Ingenious project is a really exciting project, 4 years long. We're about a year and a half in. And what we're looking at here is we're actually going to go into people's homes in Bradford, and we're interested in the intersection between indoor air quality, health and behaviour. So hopefully everything I've told you so far, you understand why we're looking at those 3 things together. Because we know that you can go and do your measurements, you can look at health effects, and you can look at behaviour, but if you do them all separately, you can never understand the whole picture. So we're trying to do it all together. And you can see it's a big collaboration, lots of universities and lots of project partners as well. So we're using the Born in Bradford cohort. So this is a very well-studied cohort of families in Bradford, and there are tens of thousands of people signed up for this study, and they've been following the health of the children since they were born and also the families. So there's lots of very rich data about the health effects, or the health data for this cohort. And we're going to go into their homes and put some air quality monitors in those homes over a period of 2 weeks. And while those monitors are there, we're also going to ask them to log their behaviour, so tell us about what they're doing. At the same time, we're going to be driving around Bradford and also doing some experiments in York, trying to understand if we can see the impact of what sort of groups of buildings at least are doing on the outdoor environment as well. And then we've got our labs back at York where we'll be taking some of these samples back. So as well as just doing some very low-cost sensor-type measurements, we're going to be doing some much more advanced measurements as well, and that requires analysis back in York. So hopefully, in about a year and a half, 2 years' time, we'll have some really interesting data that's come from this study. So in the meantime, and I wanted to tell you about interiors as well. So interiors, we've just found out just before Christmas that this has been funded. This is going to be a brand new facility built on the University of York campus. And within this facility, we're going to have the ability to really look at indoor air quality in a realistic environment. So we're going to have a semi-detached house with an integrated lab, and those two sides of the house will be built to different energy efficiency standards. So we can do some experiments and understand the impact of energy efficiency on the results. Right, so solutions. So I often get asked about cleaning devices for homes, and there's lots of caveats and problems with a lot of indoor air cleaners. So if you go onto Google and you do a search, there's lots of these things. They vary in price, they vary in size. A lot of them are ineffective. So if you are going to buy one, the ones that work by filtration are best. A lot of the others have technology that's unsuitable for indoors. And also some of them can do things like make ozone, which is the last thing you want to do in a house. So a lot of care to be taken with these cleaning devices. Houseplants. I also get asked a lot about houseplants, and it feels like a really nice solution that you can just put a few plants around and soak up all the pollutants. And this is all really kicked off by some work that NASA did probably in the 70s and 80s when they were thinking about space travel and how to keep the astronauts safe while they were in space shuttles, for instance. And there is maybe some evidence that on a small or a concentrated scale, perhaps in a small area, houseplants might do something. But this is kind of an artist's impression of what your house would have to look like for houseplants to actually do anything even approaching an effect that you could sense. So not really. So what can we do? There are lots of things that we can do. The first thing that we can think about is removing pollutant sources from buildings. So sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's harder. So I was giving a talk once and I was saying about this, and this lady in the audience said to me, well, my problem is my dog, it smells. And sometimes you can't actually get rid of your dog, can you, or your smelly teenager. So then we have to think about another source, another way to solve the problem. So we could increase ventilation rates. It's nearly always possible to open a window. So obviously if you live on a busy road, it can be harder, but then it's sometimes possible to open a window at the back of the building or to avoid rush hour, for instance. And if you can't do all of those things, that is when we're into the territory of air cleaning. So cleaning. There's some simple things you can do with cleaning. Not do it too often for a start off. That's my motto. You can use liquid cleaners, not sprays, and that's quite a simple thing to do. And the reason for that is that when you use a spray, you immediately turn the chemicals in your cleaning product into aerosols, which are easier to breathe in. So liquids are better. Beware of claims that products are chemical-free. No product is chemical-free. They might be marketed as natural or green, but that doesn't mean to say they're lower emission products. And never mix cleaning products. So it's amazing the number of people that don't actually follow manufacturers' instructions on the back of these bottles. So with cooking, it's always better to use the rings at the back because the cooker hood is more effective for the back rings. Make sure that the cooker hood vents outside, or open the window. Again, 10 minutes. If you open the window and you're cooking for 10 minutes afterwards, you don't lose any extra heat. You just lose the heat you've generated for cooking. If you're renovating a kitchen, you could take that opportunity to switch to electric. And then try not to fry too many bacon butties. That's the other thing. And if you do, ventilate well. So the take-home message really is moderation and ventilation. Not trying to say anyone shouldn't do these things, but just think about ventilating when you do them. And with that, I think I'd just like to put up my acknowledgements. So I'd like to acknowledge my group. Some of them are here tonight. They're a lovely group of people. And also some colleagues in chemistry, and then the funders that have provided the funding for some of the research I've talked about. And thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Nicola, very much indeed. A little bit daunting. In many respects, really. As one who doesn't like cleaning anyway, actually, I've been, I think it's a great lecture. But in other senses, when we're all very aware of things like diesel and how very, very polluting that is and how we absolutely must avoid that. But are you saying that, in terms of sort of danger levels, how dangerous is it to be in the kitchen on a regular basis? I'd just like to check, So
I think the answer to that is that nobody knows for sure. So it's really hard to do the sort of studies that you need to do to understand if diesel particles are more toxic than cooking particles. Because you need quite a lot of people, you need quite a lot of time, and those studies are expensive and very hard to do. So we know a lot about diesel, but we know much less about cooking. So I guess your gut feeling would tell you that it's probably not as bad as diesel, but that's all it is.
Yes.
And if you look at COMEEP, which is the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution, at the moment the advice is to treat all particles as equal. So I'd say it's a really huge gap in the research field that we need to understand that a lot better.
Thank you. I mean, certainly the chemicals in bleach and things like that, you're very aware, aren't you, to walk away from and not breathe in any sort of way.
Yeah.
Could we just, I'm sure there are questions, and please do flag up if there are questions, but can we just talk a little bit about your work with the Department of Health and just whether you are you advising the government and companies about this, or...
So I sit on COMEEP, which is the Committee for Medical Effects of Air Pollution, but I sit on there as an atmospheric chemist.
Right.
So I'm not a health person.
Right.
Obviously, everything I do, the end point is we're worried about the health effects, but I'm not personally a health specialist.
Right, okay, thank you. And forgive me, are there questions? Thank you. Are you bringing a microphone down? Could you perhaps put your arm firmly up in the air and then this young lady can find you? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate it's a very long and complex subject, but I'm interested particularly in the long-term effects of some of these and how your research is covering, if you like, the span of the 79 years. I mean, I'm particularly mindful of the lucid description you give of the Danes lying in the bath surrounded by the candles. But I'm also mindful that the Danes have one of the highest life expectancies in Europe, and they are also one of the happiest, if not the happiest country in Europe. So to what extent does it actually matter?
I think that's a really good question. I think it goes back to what we were just talking about, that at the moment, we just don't understand the differential impacts of different types of particles. And it may be that the candle particles aren't as bad for our health. But nobody really knows at the moment.
A gentleman at the front there.
That's a nice lecture. So my question is it possible to look at the polyaromatic hydrocarbons that are most probably attached to the particulate matter and also other other carcinogens, and then say that probably if you find these kind of compounds on your products, or maybe we can say that these products have these compounds, and then if you find these compounds, you better stay away from those. Is it possible? Especially for the green compounds, we have, I'm sorry, I forgot the name. Is it the lemon smell?
Yes.
So there are a lot of, the concentrations are very much high in green products. So is that more carcinogenic than the non-green or regular products, chemical products?
So I think the PAHs you're probably going to get when you cook, because that's a combustion type product. Certainly when we do the Ingenious study and we go into people's homes, the idea is that we are going to look at some of the particle composition in detail. So we'll take samples back to York, and Jackie Hamilton's group will be looking at that in a lot more detail. There's also a sister project going on in Manchester, where what they're doing there is actually looking at not individual compounds, but they're looking at the mixtures from cooking versus diesel exhaust versus other sources. And they're going to then expose the group of profs who wrote the proposal, because it's easier to get away with the ethics that way. So they're just going to expose the group of the people who wrote the proposal to these different mixtures to see what the impacts are. So I think there's work starting to happen like that, which is what we need. But at the moment, it's still really a big unknown.
Thank you. Lady just there.
What about particles, things like radon that come up from the earth? Also, maybe houses are being built on landfill sites. Does all that have an impact as well? I'm sure it does.
So it will do, and there are definitely parts of the UK where it's a much bigger problem. So anywhere that's built over granite, for instance, like the southwest, I think Cornwall and Devon. But I think these days that's checked more often when people move house. So I think you have to have a radon check now. And it's also quite easy to remediate. So if you know there's a problem, it's relatively easy at least to put in ventilation that stops it coming up into the house. So, I mean, I guess what we're really focusing on here is more of the chemistry. So, but you're right, that would be a problem in certain parts of the UK.
Thank you. Professor Sir Robert, so go backwards slightly down the other end.
I just wondered, what's the relationship between the emissions you've been talking about, and what I call dust, the stuff that you get in your... Are the two related? Is there a deposition of that material?
Yes. Yeah, there will be.
Is that a lot of the dust that we're picking up?
So, yeah, it just gets called lots of different stuff. So some people refer to it as dust, some people refer to it as particulate matter, but it's really this, the little specks of stuff in the air. And it can fall out, it can deposit. You can see that because if you don't dust for a while, you can run your finger along a surface. So that's all sorts of things. A lot of skin oil as well. We shed lots of skin flakes every day. So yeah, it would depend on the setting, but it will definitely deposit.
Gentleman behind you, Richard.
Across any fluoropolymers in your research at all in terms of polluting?
No, that's not really something we've looked at. What do you think the sources of those would be? Right, yeah. I think there's probably some groups in America that are looking at that, and the whole non-stick thing, is that what you're alluding to? Yeah. But we haven't really looked at that at York at the moment.
Yes, sorry, back. It's obviously just a sort of gentle wave backwards. Keep on going backwards a bit more. Find somebody with their arm in the air.
I was just wondering about the impact of humidity.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
In terms of humidity and climate change, sort of what you have as the climate changes and gets wetter and more humid, what will be the impact on the chemicals in our homes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's some really interesting results from that American study that I showed you, and you can see that when you get water-soluble compounds, they were showing that when they had the air conditioner turn on and off, you could remove and then release some of the water-soluble compounds. So you'd expect a lot more of that kind of aqueous phase chemistry to be happening. But I don't think anyone's really thought about that in detail yet.
Thank you. Oh, gentleman down here, sorry.
I just wondered if different furnishing materials actually had the capacity not only to emit some of the pollutants that you talked of, but do they have a capacity to perhaps absorb and accumulate as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you've got a fleecy surface, like carpet or a sofa, for instance, something quite soft, and if you could look at them under a microscope at that, you'd see there's lots of fibres in a very large surface area. So we know that things like that are really good at acting as somewhere that things like ozone can deposit. So we know that there's quite an effective removal rate of ozone indoors, and it's all to do with surfaces. So it'd be very different in a lounge perhaps to a kitchen, because you've got all of that fleecy sort of stuff in a lounge.
Sorry, is that a gentleman over there in the corner?
Hi.
Hello.
I just wondered whether you had any insight about the use of log burners on indoor air pollution. Thanks.
It's not really my field. I tend to look more at the chemistry. So there's a big debate going on about log burners at the moment. There's probably more of an issue for outdoors. So if you have an area where you can imagine a street maybe in a bit of a dip where you can gather the pollution, and you have a whole street using them, maybe there'd be an outdoor problem. I think this is something that people are looking at in quite a lot of detail, but not at York. It's not really what we do. But
Thank you. And someone right at the back, sorry. Yep. Thank you, Jim.
The room have any effect on the results of your research? Like, for example, some buildings have a very high ceiling space like this one, or a Victorian house has a higher ceiling than, say, a modern-day house.
yeah, it will, just for the simple fact that you'd perhaps get more dilution. There was a study done in a church in Germany about 20 years ago, and what they found, partly because of the thermal effect as well, they had lots of candles burning, and they were able to find lots of nitrogen oxides that all sort of floated up to the ceiling. So sometimes, if it's combined with a thermal effect, you might have something like that happening, but generally, if you've got a bigger volume, you get more dilution. So it would have an impact.
And does that then float down again at some stage?
I guess once they'd blown out all the candles and everyone had gone home, it probably would have just come back and deposited and eventually got ventilated out.
Interesting, thank you. Gentleman here, sorry, thank you. I keep on saying sorry for this young lady to keep whizzing up and down.
Thank you. You haven't mentioned anything concerning the aerosol sprays and the issues there with VOC emissions. I know a lot of work has been done at York University from Alistair Lewis's team.
Yeah.
And it's probably one of the biggest emitters in the house.
Certainly in terms of things like butane, you will have a lot in an aerosol can. I don't know so much about the fragrance chemicals, but I think Ali's done work where he's looked, certainly in terms of the source of butane, it's a massive source. And some of the volatile organic compounds now, we think that even outdoors, maybe up to half of some of them, the main source is now indoors. So we're at a time when air quality is switching, I think, between thinking about what's going on outdoors and indoors, and vehicle emission technology is improving outdoors, so lots of outdoor concentrations are decreasing, and at the same time we're using more of these things in our homes. So it could be that the home ends up becoming a source for what's going on outdoors, which is partly what we want to look at with Ingenious.
I asked the question because I'm actually in the aerosol industry, and I know talks are going on with our industry Barmer.
Oh, okay, yeah.
At the moment.
Yeah.
But also just down on the A19 in the Escrit Business Park, there's a company who selling eco valves, which means that compressed air or nitrogen can drive aerosols in future.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will make a great difference.
Yeah. Okay, interesting.
Thank you. And gentleman just there, thank you.
For this excellent lecture. I just wondering that if we use different kind of cooking appliances, so does it really make any sense in this emission and pollutant levels? The second point I wanted to know, like in a city like London, and those houses built just beside main roads, so the pollution is more higher in the roads. So if we open the window, so it's maybe like outdoor air pollution is entering inside the home.
Yep.
And the third point is also like when you're doing this research, the level of secondhand smoking or smoking will be more harmful than this gas cook stove, because almost all the developed countries as well as developing countries, they are promoting cooking with gas stoves. So it's the highest form of energy ladder. So yes, please share your opinion.
Okay, I will try and remember all those points. So the appliances, I think I did allude to that it's tricky, isn't it? So if you are renovating a kitchen, it would make sense to get rid of gas because you would then get rid of a source of pollution in the home. So that is one thing. What was the second point, sorry?
So the second point is that if any household is
Yes, with being by a busy road, yes. Well, that is tricky, but it may be possible to open a window on the opposite side to the road. It may be possible to avoid rush hours, or there are a few circumstances where you might want to use air cleaning. So I'd say most houses you don't need air cleaning, but there might be a few instances where it's hard to avoid. And then you'd probably want to go to filtration, not the other weird and wacky technologies you can see out there.
Thank you. Just the last couple of questions, if I may. There's a gentleman just to your, anyway, that side.
Excuse me, pyridine in coffee, how does that happen? Pyridine's quite carcinogenic.
It's just, I think the people who did that study were really surprised when they saw the pyridine peak, but they repeated it several times. It's definitely coming from coffee. So it must just be when you heat up the beans, perhaps, it must just be released. I mean, it's not, in huge concentrations. Otherwise, probably none of us would be here, would we? Yeah. But it was just enough to see that peak, and it was distinctive for making coffee. So I think they had like a drip filter, and then that's when they spotted it.
And then the last question, the gentleman who I know quite well.
Your husband?
Yeah, my
husband. Many years ago, in designing cases in museums for preserving costumes, we realised that sealing the case completely and then introducing positive air pressure was a way of avoiding any potential contaminants, even with movement of people around them, etc., etc. Yeah. So should we learn from that, and should architects today who are inevitably looking to seal houses to keep in the heat and keep out all sorts of other things, but if it's sealed, at some point in the day, surely we should be exuding some air with a positive pressure system. So should we be thinking now about positive pressure systems being installed in all new houses?
I have to think through the implications of that. It's complicated because you've got stuff, some things coming in from outdoors, like fresh air might help, but then you also bring in things like ozone from outdoors that drive the chemistry, so it needs some careful thought, I think. But they already do that in places like operating theatres and hospitals as well to keep the bugs out and stuff, so yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. You've given us an enormous amount to think about, an extremely interesting lecture. So if everybody didn't mind just giving me an enormous round of applause for Nicola. Thank you.